To open, Malavika, this is you, open access.
Can I quickly get one?
Yeah.
So I think as a panel, when we discussed this, the idea came about because we were talking about being possibly challenged on pricing. And that's where it stemmed from, really, because I have more than once been sat in an editorial board meeting and had a comment like, well, why don't we just publish it and make it free? Or why don't we just, after a year, just lift the paywall on everything going back? And these sorts of challenges. So I've had the managing editor, the editor-in-chief, and me in the publisher role, people will just look at me and say, change the business model, or why do you have this business model? And, those sorts of things can come up. Certainly that's been my experience. So I guess we wanted to talk a little bit about if that does happen, or, do people experience that happening? How do you handle it if you are just challenged on access model, business model, pricing, those sorts of things? So I do have some thoughts, but I thought I'd open it up to the floor first for discussion. Like, does it happen? Does this happen with you? Do your editors ask you about business models? And, how do people tend to respond to that? Because what you don't want happening is you don't want it to turn into a fight. And you don't want to, you want to make sure that you keep the editors on side by demonstrating to them the value of why you've taken a certain position on things. So what I've found to be helpful in my approach when dealing with this sort of a situation, literally where somebody's turned around and saying, but just make it free, what's the problem? Which has happened, is basically to bring the conversation round to the key theme of sustainability and their needs and demands being tied in with the journal viability. So, why are we all here? We're here talking around Journal X. If you want Journal X to exist, there is a sort of there is a viability question there, most often, or certainly in the cases where pricing has come up with me, where I've had to just turn around, bite the bullet and say to them, we have to address sustainability, and there isn't getting away from that. So given that we are operating in that framework, we need to choose a model. That model is dictated by the publisher. You sometimes do have to come down, I found, quite firmly on the fact that it isn't the board's remit to discuss pricing. But what you need to be careful of when you're positioning that to them is, again, not to get them sort of angry about it or want to pick a fight with you about it. So it's about demonstrating the value of why you've chosen a position. And something that I find can help with that is to talk about access models, because there is a lot of confusion that I have perceived amongst editorial boards, amongst academics, around free versus open. And I find that I have to keep repeating myself around the fact that these are two different things, and literally draw up a list of differences between them and say free access is when we are voluntarily choosing to lift the paywall. It could be time limited, it could be 1 day, it could be 3 weeks, it could be in perpetuity, but that's not a given. And there aren't any specific reuse terms or sharing terms around it. It's just published under a standard license. So, that's one approach, and where you've got to think about what you're willing to concede. If these people want to talk about, well, why aren't we doing this sort of thing, then draw their attention to, well, where might it be appropriate to do such a thing? So if you've got particular editorials and you say, so we entered into a negotiation with the board around this, and we came out with an agreement that solicited editorials, highly opinionated pieces written by people on the board and things like that, we would say, okay, we will lift the paywall on those and make them free to access for a period of 3 months or for a period of 6 months, you know, and sort of turn the conversation to, okay, what can we do? What's allowable? And make that distinction then between open, because people use that term interchangeably, and sort of drive home the point that open access is where the paywall is lifted under terms of a specific license. The metadata is tagged so that even in a machine-readable format, you've got that understanding that you have that license. The article will be perpetually free to access, so it's not like free access where it could be just 3 weeks, right? Open access, it's in perpetuity, and there's certain reuses that often come along with open access, and that's specified in the terms of the license under which the open access article is published. So I guess know what and where you'll be willing to concede or already do concede, because sometimes you may already be doing this and it's just about reminding them, hey, we do these for these article types, or when we put out a press release against a particularly press-worthy article, we'll make a commitment, or we already do make a commitment, to make sure that the paywall is lifted for a particular length of time on those articles. But also alongside that, emphasizing what your access policy is, and link this with the sustainability of the journal and why that's important to them and in their interest as well. Any other thoughts or questions around access models, pricing challenges?
I have one. So I get all the time, if this article was free, the citations would go up. Now, we've not seen a correlation with that in our own, you know, looking at our own. Has anybody else seen a correlation? You do?
Yeah. Pretty dramatic.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Wow. And what is your field?
Computer science.
Computer science.
And do your board challenge you on that? Do they challenge you on the access model side?
They don't challenge us on it. I mean, we show them the data pretty freely, and it's always, I would say, tempered with the discussion about sustainability. If we could open everything tomorrow, that's great, but then 5 years down the road, we may not be around. So.
Do you know what percentage is open access? What percentage of articles are open access?
A very small percentage. I mean, we have about 500,000 articles, full text articles in our database, so it's less than, I would say, 5% now, 4 to 5%.
So I guess the one thing that I'd also, well, two things I'd also jotted down. One was sometimes it can be helpful to remind people about archiving policies, and that route exists as well. That conversation can help when you're being challenged. So that was one thing. And the other thing was, at the end of the day, you still want to welcome their input and their feedback, because, you know, it's worth having a conversation about what's right. It comes back to what's right for this journal at this point in time. And I'm not going to stand here and say you should always take a particular line, because sometimes it becomes relevant to look at the model as well. So one of the things that we're doing with the Biochemical Society journals is we keep a close eye on our ratio of paywalled to open access content in all of our hybrid journals. And we are looking at where it might start to become relevant to talk about flipping or transitioning those journals. So, you know, we tend to, you know, when I thought we should talk about this as a discussion point, it was not because I was taking the line of being defensive about something, but also that it's important, you know, to raise the point that it's important to think about models and look at what might be appropriate, because in some cases, potentially it might be. And that's where, if you've been having a conversation all along with your board, then you can bring them with you if it's relevant for you to start talking about transitioning the model, or start talking about experimenting and saying, well, shall we, you know, do something special for a particular type of article, and ask authors if they want to, you know, say that we're experimenting and we want to ask all review articles to go open or research articles to go open or whatever. I'm making things up now, but you know, be open to having that conversation and listening to them, because if they are likely to want to challenge you about pricing, so much the better for you if you are going to be willing to talk with them about it. And it comes back to that thing Patrick was saying about the worst thing you can do with your editors is ignore them. So, you know, they want to be listened to, they want to be heard, and engage them in the conversation. You can always fall back onto the sustainability line when you need to.
Oh, sorry. I'm Alexandra. I'm from the American Anthropological Association. I was curious on your thoughts about how discipline-specific repositories fit into this discussion of open access and how you see them affecting sustainability.
Yep, it's a great question. So I do not know much about the social sciences and that side of things, but certainly. Certainly in the sciences and certainly in the UK, there is a drive to make sure that author-accepted manuscripts are put into repositories. I know in the US you have, well, not just in the US, but I think it started in the US, you've got Chorus, and you know, that seems to be a good solution because it has the articles in the AM format, the author manuscript format, that do become available after an embargoed period, and that way, you know, you're also keeping the traffic onto the publisher's site. But the question about sustainability, I think, is a key one, and is exactly why, while I don't have a brilliant answer, and I wish I did, I think that's exactly the reason why I'm putting out there the thought around, think about the models, think about, does it become relevant to transition, or when might it become relevant to transition? And it may not be relevant at all, but certainly in some disciplines where you have a lot of green open access content, a lot of repositories, then those are times and areas where you might want to start thinking about this.
What do you tell your editors, or what are your thoughts on that?
So we have 20 journals in our portfolio, and one of them is open access, and they have been a very loud voice clamoring for the whole portfolio to go open access. And so we started doing kind of a hybrid approach to open access, and started I don't even know if you would call it a virtual journal, essentially, called Open Anthropology, which invites, it's topical and publishes maybe once or twice a year, and so there was just an issue on gun violence, so the Open Anthropology editors go to all the other journal editors and ask for, like, what is your best article on gun violence, and then they compile it in an issue. But this wasn't enough for the voices clamoring for open access for the portfolio. So then what we started doing is looking at a discipline-specific repository as a way to answer the membership and these editors, and say, like, okay, we do hear you, we do see value in this. But so we are, especially, there is some concern about what will happen. Like, we want to ensure that with the discipline-specific repository, we're not actually competing with our own portfolio. Yeah. And especially considering, I think there was an article in Scholarly Kitchen last week about the presence of articles in repositories actually bringing down downloads of the articles of record. So
what are you putting in your repository?
So we will allow preprints in the repository, but we're also looking to include conference materials as a way of making our annual meetings more accessible, the content of our annual meetings more accessible to those who may not have the means to attend, and keeping in mind that we serve anthropologists, so they're very much so invested with social justice, and everything is about power. So,
because my question was going to be, and I kind of took it as a given and probably shouldn't have, that when I was talking about open access, that there would be an article publishing charge against that, and hence transitioning business models was what I was talking about, and I failed to mention that that pivotal point earlier, but how do your editors respond to the idea of, if they want you to make it all open, are they willing to pay a charge for the publication?
They're absolutely not willing to, and because
That's it. Yeah.
because it is part of a portfolio model, our authors have not had to do this because the executive board of the association and the publishing committees have decided, okay, we can pull some funds over here and over here to support this venture.
Yeah, so I think it's about demonstrating what it takes.
Exactly.
Because if your author on a per article basis isn't having to pay that charge, it's being very, very clear about the fact that someone somewhere is. So it comes back to demonstrating that point.
Right. Thank you.
All right, so we're about up for time, and I just have a couple of housekeeping things. I would like to do this type of session every year, and if you're interested in, I'll be sending around. I have your names and your companies, but SSP won't give me your email addresses. So if you want to have some input into what type of format we do next year, what maybe bringing in all editors to have a kind of session, expanded session, just leave me your business card up at the corner of the table or hand it to me on your way out, and we'll organize something for next year. And then the last thing I want to do is talk. Angela, during the session, during the break, brought up something that is actually a little horrifying and is an unintended consequence of some of the social media that I think is important. So I'm going to let her talk about what we talked about.
Oh, wow. Thank you. So as you all remember, at the end of the first half, we talked about having professors have like a abstract video of their work, and the first two things that popped into my mind was that song from the 80s called video called Kill the Radio Star. So all of a sudden you're judged on a different platform for different abilities. And then the other thing for you history buffs was the Kennedy-Nixon elections. I don't remember it, but I studied it, and how leading into the debates Nixon had the lead and was more favorable, but at the end, Kennedy had the lead and was more favorable because he was young and charismatic and looked really good on the screen. Whereas the folks who listened to the debates, if you all remember or know about it, thought Nixon won the debate. So it just made me think about professors and some writers in general. Their personality may not translate in the same way on a video platform, and then there's some of us, I would like to include myself in that group, who would excel in that arena. So we'd have to think about different ways to illustrate our strengths on that media platform, and that's something that would need to be researched and thought about, because it could, really be the end of some people's careers or ability to reach a larger audience. And then, of course, in our climate of social media, people comment. We all have feelings, and some things can go viral unintentionally or intentionally. That's kind of how it happens, but just other things that I wanted to add. Thank you.
Yeah, important research is done by people, not just the pretty people or the charismatic people. So you heard it there first. In 20 years, when we're all lamenting what's happened to our industry. Does anybody else want to add anything before we break? I really appreciate everybody coming out. I hope you found it helpful. I think it's helpful to just talk to other people who are doing the same thing. And I hope to see you next year and throughout the rest of the week. Thanks so much.